people don't know, I fight with my sword farther back towards my hip, and keep my stance squared up, hips and shoulders square to my opponent, in sword and dagger specifically. And over the years, there's a lot of people who have said that this style wasn't a period fighting style, or that it wasn't as good as other is like a more profiled, more sword, more forward style. I don't believe that to be true. And I even says in my video that I think that actually the way that I fence is probably better, which I'm willing to debate if it's better or if it's just a good way to fight, and there are other equally good ways to fight that I choose not to do it. But I think part of the reason I said, and this is kind of a response to Mateo, the reason I said that I thought my way was better was probably because I felt because for so long I'd been told the opposite. I think I felt a little the need to make a strong, bold statement to counter the other way. And that was potentially wrong, and I maybe could have been a little more nuanced in that take, which I think is a fair critique. I do think that many of the highest end fencers in the SEA right now and in HEMA fight with something very similar to the way I fight, with their sword is either back, or in the case of the Black Tigers, which is like the way Boomy and Toratako fight, their sword actually down touching the ground. My blade is up, and my hand is pretty far back. So I make the argument in my video that I believe that this is a good way to fence, if not maybe just the best way to fence, and also that it is, I don't go too much into that, but it is also a historically documentable way to fence. Like, there are period masters that advocate for that, for something very similar to what I'm doing. So that was a video I made, and then Mateo put a video out discussing alternative ideas, and if you want to go into that, Mateo.
Yeah, I agree about historical precedent for certain. Although people, depending on the context of when people, sort of caught beef with the idea that fighting like that was ahistorical, it could also be based on the level of scholarship that existed at the time. But to be clear, like even going all the way back to Degrassi, although it's a side sword manuscript, you see his low ward isn't all that much different than your guard. His hand's a little further drop down, but that's about it. His broad ward just has it out to the side, so it's all available. Fabris does something like this, and then if you look for just barely post-period stuff, it becomes a little bit more common as well. So it's not ahistorical any more than like my sort of general sword forward, amalgam Italian way to fight is specifically historical. I can be orthodox if I want to. I can be like, today I'm going to be Fabris, but I don't have to be. There's sort of a general Italian vibe that I can do when I have my sword forward. But yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. No, my thing is this notion of an ideal form, and I said that in my video, where I think that there's more that goes into it than posture, and where we carry it. I think it's at a certain level of excellence. I think it's about the individual fighter, their natural gifts, their training, their practice, sometimes the context of their practice, like who they fight with and alongside or against, has something to do with it. So I think it's just a little bit more complicated than finding like the way, if that makes sense.
I pretty much agree with that.
Question for you, Mateo, from the chat. Is there, or did you start with an extended guard? Like, is that part of your fight?
I did not begin that way. I've been fighting since 1997, so for a while. And so I've gone through like, I don't know, half a dozen iterations on how I fight. Initially, it was very like the SCA and fencing in 1997 in Wisconsin has a context, right? So like you have people that were teaching at the time, and so it's this blend of like modern epee and what people who were like Onstjorn transplants brought to us, plus experimentation at the time, plus people who had modern fencing backgrounds, all kind of boiling in the same pot. But when I found period rapier, I got really interested in it because I thought it was fascinating to look at and investigate and try to be very orthodox with it. And so that's still something I love to do. And so my style shifted into that eventually. And then I started like doing like, oh God, I'm going to say a series of words, but it makes sense to me, like period Jeet Kune Do. So you take like an amalgam of a bunch of different period stuff that works for you, and you do that in the fight when you're trying to be worried more about competition necessarily than like exhibition. So yeah, and I was competitive with Orthodox period stuff, and then I was competitive with non-Orthodox period stuff for a long time. So it all worked out. But yeah, my style definitely shifted. I definitely fought sword refused for years. Like that was a way that we fought.
Oh,
That was one of the ways that I was taught.
I think to talk about the context thing, I think that when you come up in an environment, which is where I came up from, in a place where people are very active with their daggers to defend, then the sword coming refused makes more and more sense, because if the sword hangs out there, especially when you don't have a very well developed disengage, like if you're newer and you don't have a disengage that's super good yet, but a lot of people have good dagger parries, then you will just die. And so some of the refused guard is a sort of a counter to active dagger, which is where, and I came up. I started fencing in 2007 in Austin, Texas, in Onstura, and the people that taught me it was very active dagger, and they were specifically the people teaching me were trying to teach sort of a modified-ish Degrassi, with leaning a little more to the rapier. But that was also, but it wasn't, even though it was said to be Degrassi, that the refused guard wasn't like counter to what was popular fighting at that time. I think the traditional Onsteuren style is a little bit more forward than I am now, with a little flatter blade, kind of like a modern epee stance. I think that's what I think of as like old school Onsteuren, is the like the elbow tucked to the body and then the hand straight.
Yeah, 100%. Very gunslinger.
Yeah,
Your modification is an evolution of that, I
very
believe.
think like I would think like Miguel, Duke Miguel, and Ingrid, and some of the backyard fencers. So like Modius and Tristan. I always thought that of being that fighting like that was, I always thought, like the Onsteuren style, and I felt like what we did was what I was taught by the people who taught me, and then my brother and I developed was kind of like some in a little bit of period fencing injected into that Onsteuren style, so the hand came back a little bit. Our daggers were more active than the traditional Onsteuren style, I think, because the dagger was more of a passive thing, but it was more snipey. But people like Kelly, especially Kelly, Master Kelly, who was one of my teachers, he had a very active dagger, and so like if you stuck your sword out there, and Gwyneth would be another example of that, very active daggers, and so if you stuck your sword out there, they would just kill you, straight up.
Yep.
And then I probably added to that too, because my dagger I think is very good, and so like I think that I forced other people to bring their swords farther back too.
Yeah, I wouldn't describe your dagger work as passive. I would describe it as settled, relaxed. Yeah, I don't know that I would use the word passive because it's
Yeah.
very, very solid. So you just don't reach out. You don't make that same, like, you don't give that tempo out. You don't hand that tempo out
No.
anymore. So
Well, yeah, and that was part of the process of learning my style of fighting, was if I gave a tempo with the dagger, then people like yourself, and even the people like I remember Avery killing me for this when I was coming up, would disengage and hit me in that tempo that I was giving them. And so I
mhm.
learned to get myself to a position where I could use the dagger to create the opening I wanted without reaching. And that's just a part of learning the way I fight. And that's something I try to work with my students, and it's definitely the mistake that I see all of them make as well. Along the same, hit a point where they reach with their dagger too much and get hit with disengages.
I think the equivalent for people who fight with their sword forward would be getting busted by people who rush,
Yeah, that makes sense.
who rush well. I think that's a similar problem that you have to solve with an extended guard, is when people are able to quickly duck in past your point, and then you have no single time action to hurt them because you've got a draw cut's not good enough, and you have to withdraw that sword, yada yada. So I think it's a similar, like,
Mhm.
problem to solve.
I do think, and this is something that Mateo says a lot, and I would 100% agree, that it almost doesn't matter what style you are fighting, but you should have a system that you fight from that informs your decision making, because that will speed up your progress much faster. So whether that be a period from a period source, or whether it be one of the sort of SCA systems, like the Black Tigers have a system, I think I have a system. So I would, if you get nothing else out of any of the content that I've ever made, I would say that it's to find a system and try to learn that system, and that will make your fencing better and your progress much faster than someone who's learning more, kind of just seeing, like throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. That's going to be a much more trial and error, and it's going to take a lot longer for you to get good doing it that way.
in your video, I've watched John's, so I have an idea of what's the highlighted points. Do you believe there's a context in, let's say, current SCA fighting where that meta is not optimal, either the context of the person or the context of the bout or whatever it might be?
So I've seen a lot of shifts in what people believed was ideal over the years. There was a time when everybody fought Case because everybody believed in their heart of hearts that Case of Rapier was the optimal way to fight. You had two long weapons in your hands, and all the arguments that were made once upon a time for Case. But eventually, that went away as people began to recognize and exploit some of the issues with fighting Case against Case fighters. And then Dagger became this was the choice to go the optimal weapon style, right? There were always people with really good bucklers. I think of Brendan. I think of Isaac in our kingdom. A bunch of people with really good with their buckler. But at the end of the day, that shifted, right? So those meta, it shifts over time, and I think this one will too. So I try to avoid judging what is ideal by the current top 3% of fighters in the SCA, because that changes over time, and so it feels like a sucker's bet to try to say, okay, we found it, we found the thing, we have it, this is the way, right? It feels like that's been said many times over the 25 years that I've been fighting, and I suspect it was said historically too, in the hundreds of years of rapier combat that we had before we began playing. I don't know if that answers the direct question that you were asking. I think it does, but maybe I misunderstood the question.
It answers it in the way that I understand the perspective of meta continuously shifts, and you've been, as you're saying, kind of around long enough to see some of those big meta shifts in our particular game. I guess a more zoomed in version is there context where currently is right now, is that do you think that refused sword is the top of the I suppose the social hierarchy?
I think it's wielded by people who are at the top of that heap. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know.
So
I think the question
the
of its application is a more objective question than the subjective question of who's doing what.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Changing the form, departing the form from the person. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a hard
we
thing.
could,
That's a very fair
we could make
point.
individual criticisms of if you have your sword refused, it is inarguable that your point is further away from your opponent than if your sword is extended, right? That's just inarguable.
Right.
That has a benefit and that has a flaw, right? So all of that is an equation that an individual fighter makes based upon their abilities, training, approach, tactical idea, etc.
So I'm gonna ask a follow-up question to this. So what do you think, if you took the top 3% of fencers in the SCA who happen to right now fight more of them fight with a refused guard than with an extended guard, just if you said that if you took those fencers and you had them switch their styles, do you think that given enough time they would be just successful fighting a different style?
I think you would be more successful. That's just me being snarky. Yeah, I do think so. I actually think that they can. I think that you and Boomy and everybody is super capable of making as good a play out of another good system as any other. Yeah, 100%. In fact, I know that you can, because when you fight single rapier, you are just as, in my opinion, just as dangerous as when you fight with a dagger, because your single game is sword presented and involves single time attacks and things that people really struggle to master. And I think that if you guys did that, I do think, interestingly, I do wonder if the quote unquote meta, I hate the idea of a meta in rapier, but if the general understood what is best in life Conan idea would shift,
It's an interesting hypothetical to think about, right? I mean, I obviously fence the way I fence because I think that if it's not the best, is at least very good, right? Otherwise I would choose something else. But also, is it because it lives within a certain context, right? That's the current, and you don't like the word meta, but that's the current environment we live in, where this is the kind of the way people fight. So,
yeah.
Strategies and tactics come up to counter what is currently being done, like you've said, right? So you
Hey
can't
guys, there's an add-on.
Was Dom here?
Yeah, Mateo.
Hello.
Do you know Dominic, Master Dominic of Atlantia?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
We've
good.
met.
As long as you guys know each other.
We've met.
I wanted to make sure, introductions.
Yeah,
just in
100%.
case.
Yeah, I remember.
Dom wanted to interject with a point. I'm not sure to which particular point, but go ahead.
Yeah. So the whole thing I was thinking about when I was watching these conversations of refuse versus the sword forward is that like a couple of times we brought up the point that we're talking about the top 5% of people here as far as skill level goes. But when we're starting out and we're coming up and we're learning things, right, there are certain skills, like tactile skills, that you have to learn and become good at. And I think that sword forward provides a lot more opportunity for that. For instance, like, how your hand feels on the, while you're parrying, getting blade contact, the skill of refusing blade contact, even if your sword is out there. A lot of those skills that we have to build up over time can come. You can't really build them except while you're fighting. You know what I mean? And I'm not talking about period skills or your system, but to build the building blocks to build your own system, you have to gain those skills, physically. I think that having sword forward and getting more blade contact and figuring out how your blade works in your hand versus the opponent's sword is much better for a beginner. So I don't think I would ever start a beginner fighting refuse.
That's pretty good. That makes sense. Yeah, just more time with the blade on blade, like wrestling for mechanical control.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. Yeah.
I think it really depends on if you're teaching, because like my whole thing about Refuse Guard is it's pure sword and dagger. Like I don't think you should do it in single. I'm not, I would not.
No. Well, unless you're Connor. But
So if you're gonna, but Connor broke every rule and Williams still good, so whatever.
Yeah.
So if you're teaching, normally we teach people single sword first, right? People just don't. We have more longer swords or daggers or whatever, right? So I don't disagree that getting a feel for how the sword. But I just think that I take two fighters and I tell one, and if I'm fighting dagger, I tell one of them to stick their sword out and one to not. I think the one who doesn't stick their sword out is just going to stick their sword right and kill a lot.
With beginners?
The beginning fighting sword and dagger, I can train a new person to kill someone with extended guard, another new person with extended guard really fast.
So if you take two brand new people, right, and then they've been learning sword forward, right, single sword, and then now you're wanting to teach them sword and dagger, do you then transition them to sword back, or do sword forward first for a while?
I would probably do like sword medium. Like I tell them to pull their hand back a little bit, but not all the way. Like
So closer to like Miguel or Miles, who both are a little bit more presented than you.
Something like that. Something like that. I think
Well,
if they're doing,
something that I teach is how to refuse control of the blade when it's out forward, right? Like that's a skill you have to develop. Right. If someone wants to come at my sword with his dagger, I mean I can't just let him have it.
Right.
I mean, I just think it depends on how. If your newbie, the newer fighter is not. I think it's easier to teach someone to do a dagger parry than it is to refuse to like disengage or refuse their sword in that time. So I think the person who is going to use the dagger is going to win more in those fights.
I would say it's way easier for someone to get around a dagger at range with their blade than it is for them to catch the sword on the dagger. A new person specifically.
That's an interesting.
I think I'm a Dom on that one.
Interesting disagreement.
I think so too. Well, I spend a lot of time with we have a big. We're lucky. We're very fortunate to have a very large group of newish fighters in our barony, and I spend a lot of time teaching them single, and we fight a lot of single in our barony. But one of the things that I need to make sure that they have before we let them out into the wild is a pretty tight disengage underneath a dagger, because that is a great way to get charged in the SCA, if anything else, and that never feels good, when somebody like bum rushes you by clearing your sword with their dagger or whatever. And so I want them to have a really nice tight disengage before they go out into the wild. But I can teach that when I'm teaching them single. If I teach them good single fundamentals, they're going to have a tight disengage. So
Exactly.
They're going to then be able to hopefully disengage most people's dagger.
I mean, if we're talking about two newbies, then like you just have the advantage of measure, and you can also do a disengage because you've been fighting single.
See, I see what y'all are saying. I think it just depends on It just really depends on what you've emphasized in your teaching, right? I guess. And
Boomy,
the
we need a
and
newbie. Boomy, can you get us a newbie
Oh.
so we can ask them?
Pokemon
we
time.
need two. We need two newbies and train
No.
them differently, and then see who wins. Right?
Yeah,
Oh,
we
actual
need
experiment.
one set of twins.
All right, we have Marie in
Pikachu, I
Drew's
choose
in
you.
Chat. Drew's in chat.
Drew is not new enough anymore.
No, Drew's been
Oh.
influenced.
Did you hear that?
also.
John just called you old.
He's 20 now, so
Let's not act like old. Let's not act like old is an insult now, okay?
Drew has
Yeah.
made a decision on how they fight.
also old. It doesn't matter if they're old or young. It just matters
Yeah,
if
yeah.
how
Fencing old.
much experience they have with fencing.
Mhm.
Here's how you do it. You get two people, two fighters of approximately the same build and size, right? And you only let them practice once a week. They get their one weekly practice, standard rapier. They get 45 minutes on their Wednesday night, and they can play. And then you see how that goes.
I would be fascinated to see that.
That's
It'd be
interesting.
I mean, there's no way to control for all the
No,
variables.
that
There's
is
just
too.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's way too individual, right?
But it would be fascinating.
I mean, I can make a claim that I've had a lot of successful students fighting in the way I've taught, but that's very anecdotal, and some of them have had athletic backgrounds. Like I could say, oh, Miles was very
Sure.
successful that I taught him, but he played collegiate tennis.
Yeah,
I can
that's
say
fair.
I can
Sports.
say Drew is being very successful right now in her progress in fencing, but she also had a lot of athletic background as well. So
Yeah, there's no substitute for being fast and strong. Like that's like
One of the things,
Yeah.
this is
Definitely
for
helps.
more so in my head for grappling, but it really translates to all forms, which is when I teach grappling, I tell people that your skill only amplifies your physical attributes. It never negates them. And if
yes,
as in like if and this is like the way we do it in grappling is there's three main factors. Every 20 pounds every 10 years is worth a belt is the assumption, like a
okay.
whole belt, which means like you get an 80-year-old who's 120 fighting a 20-year-old who's 200 and they survive. They're winning by surviving even if they're the black belt fighting
Yeah.
the white belt, because they have such a disadvantage. The fact that they're surviving means that they're over producing based on expectations.
that's
I know it matters a little less here because we're using weapons that are very effective, right? It's not quite a gun, but it gets closer to one. So it levels a lot of those physical attributes. But nevertheless, there's a physical execution of our sport.
yeah.
And so I think
So
that
Boomy-
there's an amount of skill that may not overcome the natural attributes, the physical attributes.
I think people also mix up talent and skill as words a lot too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, Boomy, what would you fight with even a more refused blade than I do, right? Because your blade is also down as well as refused.
Mm-hmm.
So, would you teach a new fighter to fight with that guard, and like a brand new?
A couple of things. I'm going to backtrack one real quick point. There's a difference, in my opinion, and this is also Tora's opinion. I'm kind of reflecting what some of the stuff that he's taught. Is refusing that low guard is different than having a forward low guard. There are different things. A forward low guard, my blade is and my guard are still protecting that front leg. It's pointing at your knee, not the ground, not so low. Right? If it gets lower than that, you're offline. You're not defending something, right? Passively defending something.
Sure.
When I'm fighting you, I have to point that a little bit higher. I have to fully defend my leg. If I actually brought it to my hip, like my guard to my hip, you can still hit my foot, and I can't stop you. That makes sense. So there is like a forward low guard versus a refused low guard. With that out of the way, for myself, if I was teaching a brand new person, I absolutely teach them extended forward for the exact same reasons Dom stated. I want them to have reps on what it feels like to have to wrestle for control mechanically, because I feel like that is the crux of sword fighting. And then it's like Picasso learning to paint realism before they went to Picasso, like that concept of like learning what's the fundamental skills in the particular art.
I mean, I'll say that when you and Boomy were in the finals of the Rose, I saw all those fundamentals come out in those fights.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like I saw you guys both dig real deep on what you do to win that fight, to resolve that fight.
Yep.
Because
Go ahead.
because I was going to say that even them knowing the basics of just blade engagement and everything else, it effectively still applies even in that Boomy versus John, where they're not sword on sword, right? Because they're still effectively playing that same game of who basically has the better blade control, just not touching in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's all in space
No,
and envisioned.
And that's actually what I was gonna. Slav said the same thing that I was about to say. I was gonna say
Yes.
that
You got me to it.
I'm never advocating for someone to not use their sword. I'm just saying that I prefer to keep my sword. I don't want someone to touch my sword unless I choose to touch. Like, I want to be the one who decides when the blades have contact, right? So I'm keeping my sword out of presence for the most part until I've chosen to either sword parry or try to gain a line or something, right? So I'm not saying I'm not just using my dagger for my defense. I'm using both of my hands to fight. And what I think that what I try to teach and what I try to do is I try to fight with an integrated system where I'm using both hands all of the time. And I think a lot of people who are learning either sword forward or more sword back tend to fight with one hand at a time and not both hands at the same time.
No, yeah. No, that's very true.
And so I think what I like to try to get, especially as soon as you introduce a dagger to someone, I try to really try to think about how are we going to fight with both hands. I think I'm getting a little sidetracked here in my thinking, but really what I really would want people to do is people to just fight with both hands if they're fighting with an offhand. So dagger, buckler, whatever, but specifically with a dagger, using both hands. And two hands will usually beat one hand. And so when Boomy and I are fighting, like what y'all are saying, we were fighting with both hands the whole time, right? And that came into play in those situations, in those fights.
I have a question for you, Mateo.
Mm-hmm.
Based on something you said earlier, which is relevant to now, I suppose. You were saying that if the lot of us in here, the five of us in this chat, came up 20 years ago or 25 years ago, we would have a different primary form probably because of what was the norm socially. Do you think that there is not a end point and that it will always kind of be cyclical and ever evolving?
I hope there's no end point.
I
hope that we
because
don't
I'm
ever
curious.
perfect it.
Because some sports have been around long enough and have enough of a evolution that it stops unless people there's a kind of this is the best practice.
Yeah, I hope we keep evolving, right? I hope we keep finding new and better ways to fence. I think if we ever find the end of the rainbow, we'll have accomplished what people who actually had a harder road than us in that this could be life or death, didn't find. And I mean, maybe, that's one of the reasons I didn't find it, because the consequence of failure was death. And for us, we have the luxury of being continually at play. But I hope that everybody on this chat right now is eventually surpassed by somebody that we train, because that just means everything gets better and more interesting.
Well, I would say that part of one of the things that I enjoy most about fencing and the SCA in general is that it's kind of like any given Sunday, right? I'll fight Boomy one day and the fight will look one way. I'll fight him the next day and it'll look in a different way. And I'll fight with John and it'll look completely different. And I can always find a new way to win or lose to John or Boomy or whoever, right? I think that I just love today is the day that we're going to do the thing. And it could look completely different than next week. And I think that's what keeps us all going, right? If it ever got to the point where you could actually do a Pokemon and say, oh, no, he's better, or he's better, it would just be not as good.
Right. The in the moment variance that happens.
Yeah, no, that's what makes us different.
Okay.
It is. It's one of the reasons I have this notion that I talk about in my video about winning the duel. We fight 2 out of 3, right? And I always look to the first bout as the test and as the first, and to me, most important test, because that's 2 people coming out, and this is a big, deep rabbit hole, so I don't want to step too deep into it. But
we're here for this.
if these things were real, right? How did this encounter end in this moment? If the encounter is 10 passes long, cool, right? Then we get a percentage, right? But I'm really interested in that first bout.
You're very much not alone in that. I've heard it from a number of Shiv and Duke as well, not just the rapier side, who when they do a pickup set, they'll say, my first one is the one where I try hard, which is very it's an interesting. I have not thought that way. I've had a historically bad about being serious in a pickup set, but
Boomy.
Yeah.
Do they talk about that in practice?
Mm-hmm.
Like doing that at practice?
Literally the first,
So
first practice.
I think that's one thing that rapier fighters don't do well enough in practice is practice having that one fight where they bring everything, right? To use Mateo's parlance, like I'm going to win this duel right now.
Yeah,
I think that a lot of practices get a laissez-faire. I'm just doing some pickups, going to work on some stuff, kind of thing. And I don't think that one thing gets practiced enough. And then when they get in a tournament, they're cold.
Mm-hmm.
I think we kind of, at least in Meridia's a little bit, or at least amongst my direct people,
Mhm.
have that thing of, I mean, not in Meridia, it's more of my direct group have that, but in reverse of we do our regular pickups, and then at the end is the, okay. Now let's do 110% for like 3.
Yeah.
You know, like it's a tournament, but almost that. And not, and yeah, and I'm curious if there is any difference in let's do it at the front versus do it at the back, just because in a tourney you would be more likely cold at the front, you know.
The background I've come from is more to do like the last 3 is real, but I've always pointed out I'm fine with doing it that way, but I've also always pointed out to people like, well, in a tourney or a real fight, the first one is the most real because we do 2 out of 3, so we don't always do 2 out of 3. Sometimes we do single pass,
Mm-hmm.
and in that you only get 1 fight, and in a real fight you would only get 1 fight. So I think it's very reasonable. For Mateo's point, I will pick one counterpoint to that is that I do also know several people, including Dukes, who in a 2 out of 3 will kind of experiment in the first fight to kind of get a feel for what they're
Feel you out. Yeah, feel you out.
They don't care that much if they lose it because they know that they can get a lot of information in that first fight to then win the second 2, and that is very much playing to the idea that we're doing a sport, not a real fight.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to like look down my nose at that either, right? Like it is a best 2 out of 3. That's the game, right?
Yeah.
Win 2 and win the pass. But I just as a fighter myself, because I also think about things historically, and dueling was a big thing that got me into the game. Like actually, like getting into faux quarrels with people and meeting at dawn and doing that whole thing was a big part of my early game in the SCA. That's always been a sort of front of mind for me, you know.
And I think that's very valid. I think it's just interesting the different perspectives. I certainly, to speak to your point about my fight with Kato, I certainly did not want him to beat me. I would have liked to have 2 Like I was not not playing around in that first fight because I was not thinking that way. He just got the better of me in that fight, very well, and he did it very well. So
it was a disengage around your dagger.
Yeah, I was very happy. Actually, this is a side point. I was very happy that Mateo highlighted how well Kato fought because I've known Kato for a few years and I think he's so much better now than he was when I met him. And that fight was, I barely won that fight.
It was beautiful.
He pushed me to the very limit of what I had. Other than, like I said, other than maybe Boomy in the finals, it was easily the hardest fight of that day.
Yeah, it was a gorgeous fight.
So here's a question for the group here in Discord. Do you think that if we don't change, like in our current game in the SCA, if we don't change the parameters in which we fight, do you think it can stay stagnant? The different metas, as it were, stay stagnant.
No, I don't.
Or do you think there's enough play in the rules right now that we can keep evolving it in an interesting way?
I'll go first.
Go.
Well, and then Mateo can go after me, right? I started in 2001, so what I've seen happen, and what I think is probably going to continue to happen, is that as the older generations age out, they change less, and then the younger generations come up to counter what the older generations do, and evolve it that way. And I don't see that stopping. It may revert back to a previous style, but I don't see that process stopping.
Okay.
John will one day get old. It'll happen. One day.
Y'all been waiting for it forever.
I just have to remind myself sometimes that like Logos was and is fighting in his 70s, pushing 80s at this point, and I met him when he was probably just a little older than I am now when I started. So I think that old dogs can learn new tricks too, and it takes a lot of, I think, humility and like self-assessment to do that, but it's worth doing. So hopefully we can, I hope I get better in the next 10, 15, however many years I got on my shoulders and my knees left. I hope I change and get better. So,
I mean, I do too, but at the same time, not everyone does.
Yeah.
I think I think there will always be new people who come in who bring in new ideas. So even if everyone here in this call didn't, let's say we didn't, like I think we will change because we want to get better and adapt. But even if none of us changed our fighting style and our thinking, uh, or even if we didn't want to, there will be someone who comes along who thinks about it differently and does something weird or figures out a thing that's good and or is super athletic or something or who knows what, right?
Yeah, you and your brother changed on Stuora, hands down. Like you and your brother
and
did that.
and
Okay,
so
here's one that might change it. Here's one that might change it. If we get a rapier crown and we have a bunch of heavy crossovers wanting to be king of rapier.
yeah, that's a good point because that would bring in a whole different like background of ideas and stuff to a level that we haven't had. And thinking about this from the heavy perspective, right? Like in Onstura, Duke Sven came in and was fighting two sword and fought two sword in a play that was completely different than anyone had ever conceived of, because he came from a background from a LARP game, right? From Amper,
Yep.
and it completely changed the meta and the strategy of how every heavy fighter fought, whether they fought that style or not. They had to figure out how to deal with him, and so I think you could have something. I don't think you could. So Rapier's a little more homogenous than heavy fighting, just in the style, just because of the weapon like limitation and stuff.
Yeah. And the lack of needing force.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do think that something similar could happen, and maybe, as Mateo said, maybe my brother and I were an example of that. So I think there will always be new people coming in with new ideas, and so I think that will continue to evolve and change forever, at least cyclically. Like I think we could end up with something like it was Dom, like something that we used to do coming back
Right.
around.
Another Connor that hits the scene or something like that.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Connor would be a great. Yeah,
I think one theoretical meta shift is if SCA Rapier effectively has to someday start competing much more heavily with something like a HEMA Rapier equivalent, where they are effectively doing only CNT. And if in a very theoretical world, we eventually go, hey, we're just going to go only CNT. Even if it's still rapiers, in a theoretical world, then that would then cause a insane meta shift, right?
Definitely.
In the theoretical sense of that is one thing that could push, because now even if we're still fighting rapiers, now I can just throw a wrist cut if you are off by like an inch,
I would feel way better about my chances in a future Rapier crown if that happened.
Right, it's the same thing. Yeah, like theoretically, we do Rapier crown. Rapier gets really big. We get a lot more crossovers because people are like, "Oh, I can go do SCA and be crown." Then that pushes sort of a surge to, hey, let's do more CNT. Theoretically, CNT becomes a standard. My opinion is there's no reason for it not to be, but that's a whole separate conversation.
Well, I think it's also worth pointing out that we are engaging in gross generalizations here, right?
Of course.
The meta would change very locally, I'm sure, especially with proximity to HEMA clubs and crossover from there. But that would be more local meta change.
100%. And then, but it would potentially, where if you get to that high end of where now you go we get to the Rose tourney, and Rose tourney is CNT now, and something where a John does not, like, John does it but does not do a significant amount, honestly, right, John? Or it's still more point focused. Somebody comes in and it can just counter anything point focused, and that can then throw off the meta, right? But again, this is a very, very heavy theoretical situation.
That's a really good point. That would be like probably a similar shift from going from epes and foils to the heavy rapiers. So
actually, yeah, like it would be that big, that level of shift. Yeah.
I started in the mid realm 2 months after Edmund banned the epee, so the first sword that got put in my hand was a Schlager. Right. I still this is stupid story time, but I still actually physically own the first blade that I won in my first tournament. It came back around to me through like 5 different hands and wound up like buying
That's
or
awesome.
getting it. It was crazy.
That's so good.
But yeah, it was pretty cool. But yeah, that original Schlager, like I remember people talking about epes and foils, but I'd never handled one. I didn't handle one until we went to Gulf War and they told us we couldn't fight with a Schlager. We had to use an epee and a melee, so I had to qualify with one.
Onsira was old-fashioned and clung onto them longer.
Oh my god!
Because you're old people.
I didn't want to switch over because I couldn't afford a Gorget.
Yeah, that's legit. We talk about meta, and I want to say something like sword forward, sword back. How do you train somebody? Meta, I don't think it evolves from the top. I think it evolves from the bottom.
Eh?
I think that everybody starts, right, and they start at ground zero. Maybe they have modern fencing. Maybe they've got. I had Shotokan. I had years of Shotokan before I got into the SCA, and I had Japanese swordsmanship before I got into the SCA. But that's not rapier. It's a thing, but it's not rapier. And I think that the way that you evolve the game is you focus from the top on lifting up as many people as you can, as high as they can go. And their own ambition will play into that heavily. But I do think it's about cultivating that the soil for that garden to grow. If you don't mind me beating a metaphor to death.
Oh my goodness! Let me tell you how many times I really didn't want to go fight, but I knew I had to raise the bar for Boomy and Kalen and Boris and all those guys.
Your fault.
Get all the way up there.
So
There was a brief shining moment where very young John and very young Miguel had to figure out how to beat Mateo. It was a very short moment, but it existed.
Yeah, that's
like
that's a prime
that.
example.
I think
All right, guys, I got to jump off. Mateo, it was great talking to you, man.
Yeah,
Yeah, you too.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, talk to you guys later. Bye.
to your point, Slav, of the cut and thrust. When I did Lord Baltimore's last time, I got to the finals of singles, and the person I was fighting was they do Destreza proper, and I think they were looking at Canada, but had Spanish background, and that was their heritage. That's my
correct.
belief. Anyhow, they cut me in the top of my head, and I just didn't have that high parry.
Right, you
As
just
a
don't have.
response.
There's
I
no
just don't have
counter
it.
because you're literally not
I
not used
knew
to that
exactly
at all.
what I should do. I'm like, okay, I know how to do a hanging guard parry. I just haven't done it enough for that to be reactionary.
Also,
in a finals of a
Who drops a cut straight on the top of Boomy's head?
right, yeah, exactly. I just how often do I defend that? It's next to never, and so just
He
didn't have the
jumped
reps.
to throw that shot.
I thought it was a funny point.
He was tall, but he also jumped.
That's one of my go-to side sword shots. Is me jumping and then dropping on top of somebody tip top of their head with the point.
Mateo, to your last statement of ground up, I think it is absolutely necessary to, as you say, cultivate and allow for people to flourish in the context. That is honestly our job, top down, from the peerage level, I believe. That said, to your original point, if you are somebody else's shiny, doesn't that really heavily influence them to want to do what you're doing? Oh, Dom is awesome. They are so good with a stick. I want to learn sword and stick. I've seen that.
Yeah, I want them to go, Dom is awesome. I want to learn sword and stick. And then they learn sword and stick. And then I want them to find the flaws, if they exist, in Dom's sword and stick. And then I want them to beat it. Right?
So you want
and
that
then I
ambition
want
to start there and then move past it.
Yeah,
past
to come past them.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. I too must run. I have a D&D game to play. So
All
thank you
good.
so much
Thank
for this.
you
This
so
was a
much
good
for
time.
hanging out.
Yeah,
Thanks for being
absolutely.
on. I appreciate the discussion.
Yeah,
That was a great
segment.
discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Have a good night. Enjoy the D&D.
Thank you.